The day has finally come. The biggest single landscape in the biggest wargaming board in YouTube history is going to be finished. Helms Deep is just massive, and the past 4 videos, we've already achieved so much. Today, we will not stop until the greatest location in Middle-earth is finished. In the last video, we finally built out the massive causeway and added the stables in behind here. But we left the board missing a few very important features. First, we need to finish the cliffs because this is supposed to be joining to this. We need to do all of the landforming and the scenics. We have a mega resin pour, including 2 waterfalls, not to mention the entrance to the subterranean cave complex. And of course, we need to blow up this bloody wall.
So it begins.
And then we need to add all the little details that really bring any wargaming board to life, and then film some battle reports on it. When this board is finished, it's probably going to be the greatest thing I've ever built. So strap yourself in and let's build Middle-earth together. Our first area to target for crafting completion is the main plateau landforming in front of the deeping wall. In last month's video, we built a fantastic timber frame layered with hardboard sheeting and glued down our deeping wall structures so everything is all perfectly aligned with the main board. Now we just need to transform this ugly timber surface into a glorious contoured valley floor, complete with several deeping streams. Before we begin today's crafting, it blows me away a little bit that over 70% of you guys who watch this channel are not subscribed. So I've got one little favor to ask. If you enjoy everything that I do here on Zorpazorp and you want to support all the madness, the free and simple way that you can do that is just by clicking the subscribe button. It genuinely means so much for me and the channel. Building up the foam foundation to give me something to carve into is our first mission, and our first big carving job is the riverbed itself. Once this is carved into the landform, tapering down the slope towards the outer edge of the board, I'll be able to shape the rest of the valley floor around it. With that glued down, our next phase is just a bunch of slicing and shaving foam in a really non-uniform layout. We want to create a shape that's as natural and realistic as possible without any crazy uneven slopes, which will be irritating to game on when we film the massive siege battle report. I added some more of the riverbed in its exploded state to slot underneath the removable section of the deeping wall, and then began to build up additional layers of foam up against the wall, and then blended all of the various foam layers together with a heap of polyfiller. To complete this front section of the valley, I needed to bulk out the eastern cliff with a big foam box.
Would you like me to find you a box?
Ah, thanks, Lockie lass. But while that's drying, our first rock molds will be going down in front of the deeping wall around the small bastion closest to the keep. This rock feature needs to continue the outer spire of rock thrusting east from the main rocky foundation of the castle. Then we need a few rock features out in the plains to keep tying the valley floor to the landscape around it and give this guy somewhere to stand. Then a few more rock molds to extend the eastern cliff down into the deeping wall and the valley floor and more naturally integrate this big block of cliffs with the landscape around it. Then our first big cliff job is the outer rock face on the now boxed in section of the eastern outcrop, which features a bunch of large and medium rock molds glued in place with liquid nails and then blended together with modeling compound to build up our big cohesive rock face. With those rock features blended in, our landform out here now is basically ready for paint, scenics, and eventually resin water effects. But first, it's time to jump behind the walls and get into some much more complicated landforming. So this cliff is obviously massive and currently cut in half. It needs to flow down and continue, but the landforming itself is really complicated too. This kind of slope needs to swoop down towards the river from the base of these stairs, but kind of be quite level down here, and all of these slopes need to be playable. Now in the collectible and the location, this cliff kind of continues all the way around, but because I'm sort of only building this far back, I don't think I'm going to bring it all the way across, which is going to help for accessibility of the board as well. Let's start smashing up some foam. So we've got a bit of a task here. We not only need to build a foam skeleton for our cliff work, we're also going to need some pretty chunky foam substructures for our landforming to create that sloping scree hillside that leads up to the main keep. I started off with a big foam triangular box in the back corner and then began to build out from that up against the wall with sheets and panels, gluing them and skewering them in place. Our key feature here is of course our deeping stream, which needs to wind its way down the slope towards our culvert and is eventually going to spring forth from within the glittering caves of Aglarond. With the skeleton done, I leapt back over to the workbench and grabbed my Microforge Minis resin detail pieces and rummaged through the collection of stone architectural details, settling on two gorgeous little pieces, a large archway and an arched drain grill, and then set to work mounting them into some 10mm foam sheet, which I carved with stonework. Only 10 minutes later, I've got two epic looking stone walls ready to form the fortified entrance to our subterranean caves. I then tacked those in place atop our sloping hillside and began to build up more foam sheeting around them to create the top section of our rocky valley wall, and then grabbed a whole heap of rock molds and laid them out in place to create one of our final sections of cliff work for this build. I must say, I do love rock molds and cliffs, but I'm going to be pretty happy to take a break real soon. We have done a lot. I also capped off the eastern rock wall to get it meshing nicely with the side of the board, and then it was time for a whole heap of modeling compound to blend all of our casts together. This is a particularly important layer as we need these cliffs to blend all nicely into that single cohesive rock face, as well as to really shape and sculpt the entrances to the cave network, and the cliffs need to join nicely with the cliffs we've already made sloping down on the main board. With the cliffs looking amazing, the landforming still needs a lot of work before it's ready for paint, and it all starts with the riverbed passing through the culvert. But to get that working properly, we need to make our exploded sections of deeping wall. So I jumped over to Blender and grabbed the digital files for the removable section of wall that I had cut down. I've already upscaled these files to Warhammer scale, and you can check that all out in past episodes. But today I'm going to be doing a little bit of very dodgy sculpting. First, I cut down the wall section into smaller chunks, roughly approximating their finished size. This doesn't really have to look perfect, it's just the beginning of the structure, which I will then weather heavily with some physical texture. Once I was happy with the finish, I of course need to get these bad boys printed, and with such stunning detail in the Wētā Workshop stonework, we need the ultimate FDM printer. This is the Bambu Lab P1S, and I've been working with 3D printers since my early engineering days well over a decade ago, and the technology always sort of surprises me when I look at a new machine, but no printer has blown me away like the Bambu Lab P1S. The hardware is just amazing. It's so quirk-free and well-behaved. I have just loved using it. It is lightning fast with a top speed of 500mm per second and really good acceleration, and it's just so reliable. And up here in the AMS, you can load 4 spools of filament, so you can print forever and even do multicolor options. In early January, I already printed out this monster structure, the Helms Deep stable, which I gave a glorious rocky texture using some noise generation. So there was a lot of little details to print out there, and the P1S handled it beautifully, as well as some more precise, fine detailed components like the gates of Helms Deep. The detail in the prints is just insane. This guy is going to do some serious work for us, although I don't normally print in green. Armed with enough filament to finish Helms Deep, I grabbed my new blown up wall segments and smashed them out on the P1S, and then could not resist having a play with these super cool multicolor capabilities, loading up some very pretty filaments and printing off some goodies for my girls. In Bambu Studio, you can assign what parts of the file you'd like to be what color, and then without me having to do anything, in the middle of the print, the P1S auto reloads the right color filament from the AMS and just keeps on printing. This is literally mind-bending stuff. So here are our prints. They look absolutely awesome, and we simply go kaboom, out comes that, and then these two will slot inside. Now obviously these need to be weathered and textured to look exploded, but we've now got these at the perfect height so that we can work out how all the landforming is going to operate. So a bunch of compound and foam supports can now go around the base of the soon-to-be blown-up wall chunks to build a foundation that sits at the right height for both destroyed and intact versions of the wall, and then it's time to finish all the remaining landforming inside the deeping wall, working around the riverbed and using more compound to blend the backs of the walls into the foam paneling. Then it's time to suck up all the loose bits of compound with a perfectly sized vacuum, And then our painting journey begins. First up, a simple base coat in dark grey to banish any beige foam peeking through our scenic layers to come. This grey is worked right up to the rock molds of our cliffs and the compound layers, which will eventually get blended all in by the rock mold washes. Speaking of rock molds, with all our compound mostly dry, it's time for them to get some paint too in the classic Zorpazorp leopard spotting. First, brown washes are flicked and dabbed all over the stonework, and then it's hit with an all-over diluted black wash. The absorbency of the plaster makes this just look incredibly realistic, but as we can see, a lot of the existing cliffs in this monstrous Helms Deep have been painted at different times and with different concentrations of washes, so it's not very even, and quite often the intensity of the washes will change as the plaster dries, sometimes weeks after the paint job is applied. So some of our cliffs from the last couple of videos need a second pass to really blend everything into a consistent rocky finish. I know I often chat about this in the comments with you guys, but far out, how insanely realistic do these rocks look? Just absolutely bananas for such an easy painting application. Then, with all that dry, it is finally Scenics time. Now, the location of Helms Deep is set into the mountain slopes of the Vales of the Westfold, which are covered in a rocky scree that slides down the mountainside and accumulates in the plains and valleys below. So I spent a bunch of time experimenting with some paving aggregates with a slight kind of brown tinge from the sandy base, and then tinting that with some dark grey grout to get the perfect scree toning for our gravels. For application, we simply smash down a heap of neat PVA, then sprinkle our larger stones first, sporadically across the valley floor, and then clustered pretty heavily beneath the cliffs where the sort of smaller stones would naturally accumulate, and then with a sieve, apply a fine mix of our blend of paving sand and grout to cover the bulk of the landform. Then to tie all of this down, I absolutely soak it in isopropyl alcohol and then watered down PVA. The alcohol creates a capillary action, which allows the watered down PVA to penetrate all of our aggregate blends and connect to that wet base layer of glue to lock down the entire surface. But the real kicker here is that the grout isn't just acting as a tint, it's also an incredibly strong adhesive that activates with the water in the diluted PVA, so that will start to cook off too. I applied this mixture to all our ground surfaces, blending right up into our rock mold cliffs, which just absolutely went to another level, and then left that over the weekend to fully dry.
So over the last couple of days, that has dried up beautifully. It's a gorgeous base tone for our ground covers, and it's got enough kind of texture and grit and variation in color to look super realistic. But now we need to go into this base level and kind of add in all of the oomph and all of the detail.
Our first big target area is at the base of our cliffs, where I dump a whole bunch of large stones and then finer stones and then grout and sand before using a pipette to dump on ISO and diluted PVA directly onto the super thick layer of aggregates. This gets much more glue through those thicker substrates and locks everything down tightly. I continued this process all along our smaller outcrops below the deeping wall, and then began to work right into our monster cliffs themselves, starting with our huge causeway spur, first depositing a bunch of ground cover amongst our cliff molds, but then I grabbed my sieve and started applying a huge dump of fine sand and grout mix as sort of like a weathering powder to try and more kind of blend the rocky tones of our cliffwork to the rocky scree on the valley floor. After all, the loose scree ground cover should be made from the same rockwork as the cliffs themselves, before soaking the entire cliff face in ISO and diluted PVA, dual-wielding my spritzers Halo 2 style, and then got stuck into continuing this pass across all the other rockwork. The other huge benefit of this layer is it fully seals the delicate plaster rockwork and gives the whole board a nice protective coating, and even before it is dried, we can already see how much more realistic the whole board is looking with the rocks and the ground cover tied together tonally. Then we come to it at last. The resin pour. Now, long-time viewers will know I've had some fickle experience with resin pours in the past, and while this isn't as big as the 100 pounds of epoxy I dumped on Osgiliath, it's still got the chance to go completely pear-shaped if I'm not careful. I mixed up my 2-part epoxy, stirring the hell out of it to get it really well mixed, and then dumped my first batch into the flooded breach of the deeping wall, test-fitting my intact wall section regularly to make sure that I wasn't overfilling my blast crater. And then with
with the right amount of resin in, I feathered the edges with a skewer to try and soften the surface tension of the resin and get it sitting in the landscape like water would at Warhammer scale.
So that resin is looking awesome already, and it doesn't look like it's leaking. There is like a bit of a kind of meniscus, but that's because the resin is flowing that way down the riverbed. I don't think it's going through our ground covering, which is nice and solid and sealed. But we do have some other work to do before we can start pouring resin. This is just exploded earth underneath the deeping wall, but all of these riverbeds need some kind of mossy stones and a little bit of extra scenic spice.
A mix of dark green and brown foam flock and a little earthen soil and river stones were my weapons of choice, and I applied that mix sporadically through the riverbeds, focusing kind of intensely on the regions where I thought more moss would accumulate on the riverbed, and I then secured that all in place with yet more isopropyl alcohol and diluted PVA. We of course do have to wait for that all to dry now before pouring the resin into the riverbed, but the upside of that layer is it's just another step of sealant to stop future resin leaks. Then while the scenics were out, I just could not resist adding some more extra scenic spice to our cliffs, bringing in some green and brown accents to our cliff work. Now, I know this is kind of technically veering off screen accuracy. If Helms Deep was a real location, these cliffs would definitely have some greenery, and we can even see some greeny brown tones in the composited wide shots, so I think this layer is fully justified, and it looks amazing, so who cares? Then it's time for our precious resin gates. Some flexible plastic, hot glued in place up against the end of that riverbed so it can't leak out, and then I simply glued together the join where our modular boards meet, and then while that hot glue fully sets, I gave our wooden frame a nice little touch up with dark grey before I forgot, and then it is time for more resin. I built up my depth in increments till I was happy with the look of the deeping stream, and I kept popping the meniscus of the various pores with my toothpick, and we're looking pretty bloody good. It is amazing how much life a resin pour can add to a board. It's just such a different material and textural finish to all other scenics. It just makes any piece of wargaming scenery absolutely sing, and it's leaking, because of course it is. Time to deploy the hot glue gun, this time roaring hot to try and blast through the resin and get the hot glue adhering to the wooden frame underneath and clog up the leak, and thankfully without too much resin lost, I managed to seal it up before that 24-hour Q epoxy flooded my studio floor. We don't need that to happen again.
Now I just have to work out how to get my leg out from under the table. Massive builds of this scale are just not possible without the incredible support from my Patreons. A huge thank you to all of you. Special shout out to my 3 Mega Zorptrons who got a statue on the honor wall dedicated in their honor. Jesse Patton with a marble Eowyn, the Mitigator with a marble Grimmer Wormtongue, and Tom Campione with a gorgeous Rohan Outrider in a mossy stone finish. You guys are absolute legends, and all of my incredible Mega Zorps, and the Super Duper Zorptrons who got a plaque as well. Al, Matthew, Ion, Jordan, Rob, Jen, James, Shipper, Peter, and Aimnor. A big shout out to you guys. These builds are so intensive on labor and resources, materials. These guys keep the whole operation moving. If you would like to keep this Zorpazorp madness unfolding, go and check out Patreon, link down in the description. You can get a statue dedicated in your honor, a plaque, your name's up on the banners. It's all down in Patreon, and it just means the world to me.
Up the top of our cave complex, we've got a really fun little pour into the cave, out our culvert, and then down our little waterfall. Now I need to get the right amount of resin going down our little waterfalls, because if I pour too much, it'll flood the flooded breach of the deeping wall below. So I've got that kind of hopefully right, and hopefully it stays where we want it to. While we wait for all that resin goodness to dry, it's time to finally make our exploded deeping wall. I marked up our 2 printed chunks using an old Wētā Workshop collectible for reference that has the wall kaboomed out of it, and then got to work with my multi-tool, cutting into the plastic and then bashing and smashing chunks out of the print with a hammer, and I was absolutely staggered by how well this worked. I'd sort of assumed that I would be cutting away the printed plastic and then re-sculpting broken bricks out of foam, but the multi-tool skill and a bit of brute force, I've got this really promising start that perfectly captures the way the wall was blown out. Obviously, all of that crumpled infill doesn't work for blown out stone, but the skeleton of what we want is right here on the board. Then to get this to sort of something more useful, I grabbed some polyfiller and started blending all of our grout work. Just like the rest of the Helms Deep prints, but this time I also used the polyfiller to cover up all of that printed infill and build up a kind of packed earth texture that has been ruptured by some cheeky wizardry. Then a simple base coat in dark grey with a light grey zenithal, and it's time to match the paintwork to the rest of our deeping wall. Starting off with a bunch of undertoning through the airbrush with various shades of warmer and cooler greys. Then a big overbrush in light grey to blend all our undertones together. And then a massive black wash to tone it down to the dark grey stone we all know and love for Helms Deep. Then, just to give you guys a little taste, I slapped it down, and with a bit of tweaking to blend the paintwork, that's going to work absolutely beautifully. And in the meantime, our resin is well on the way to curing and looking wonderful. But of course, this first pour of epoxy, it's very flat. It levels out and it's kind of still with no sense of dynamism, and frankly, it doesn't look very realistic. So it's time for one last special layer. I cut off the gates, which is easy to do while the resin is soft and malleable before full cure, and then grabbed some Mod Podge. This is a special gloss finish PVA, essentially, and I splodged that generously all over the resin pour. We want to build this up in sort of thicker coats wherever we want the water to be fast moving and dynamic, but still a light coverage everywhere, even in the calmer stretches of the stream. Then I grabbed my airbrush, and without any paint in it and using just air, I blow ripple patterns in the direction of movement. This process takes about 2 hours as the Mod Podge slowly thickens and hardens, but if you keep working into it, you can get these really gorgeous ripple kind of textures that look like dynamic water movement or ripples eddying and swirling through the rocky rapids and down our little terraced waterfalls. And then we begin the nervous wait for all of the white Mod Podge to hopefully go clear. While that dries, a huge shout out to the folks at Wētā Workshop for making this all possible. I've got the link to their web store down in the description. They have an amazing range of Middle-earth and Warhammer collectibles, which are absolute works of art and will just look amazing in your hobby room. And a massive thank you to Bamboo Lab for supporting this project with this gorgeous P1S. I have put so many hours on this printer now, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. If you're new to 3D printing, looking for your first FDM printer, or a veteran who needs another machine to pump out even more plastic, the P1S is the printer for you. Links down in the description. This has been a journey 23 years in the making. My very own screen-accurate Warhammer scale Helms Deep. This is like boyhood dream level stuff right now. 8-year-old Lockie is very happy, and I think this might be the best thing that I have ever made on this channel. Let me know in the comments what you guys think, but what a journey and an absolute monster result. But there is still one thing left to do, and that is to play a whole boatload of games on this massive board. So in 2 days' time, Jacob from Conquest Creations is coming over, and we are filming for 8 days straight, massive siege games on Helms Deep. So go and jump over to Zorp of the Rings, my Lord of the Rings Battle Report channel, and subscribe for that now, because in just a week after this, the first of those battle reports will be dropping, and you can see this monster in action. I hope you guys have enjoyed this journey, because Helms Deep is finished. I cannot believe it's done. God, that took a long time.